This is the Good Morning ISLA 200 show.
This podcast was prepared by the fall 2023 cohort of ISLA 200 Islamic Civilizations at McGill University.
Grab a warm drink and tune in as our presenters take you on a deep dive into Islamic hate history with reflections on how they relate to contemporary Muslim life and culture.
Welcome to the next episode of the ISLA 200 podcast. Today, we're going to focus on African Muslims enslaved in the Americas. And we're going to look into the question, how did Muslim slaves in the Americas preserve their Islamic faith while immersed in Western Christian tries at conversion? And to get us started, Emma, why don't you give us some background on Islam in West Africa?
Awesome. So Islam's presence in West Africa is a pretty big historical journey that was influenced by various factors such as trade, conquest, and cultural exchange. Although historical records indicate Islam's arrival around 1000 CE, earlier signs suggest that it was present as early as 800 CE. During the previous century, Arabs had conquered North Africa, gaining control of trade routes reaching into Western Africa. Between the 9th and 14th centuries, the prosperity of Muslims in Northern and Western Africa played a vital role in accessing information about what was called the Bilad al-Sudan. This region was south of the Sahara and inhabited by Black peoples. This era saw a surge in international trade with Western Africa, fostering internal trade, urbanization, and the rise of monarchical governments. Control over trade routes significantly shaped the Islamic character of Western Africa. Two prominent kingdoms in Western Africa captured early Muslim interest. These two are the Kanem in the east, north of Lake Chad, and Ghana in the extreme west. Not to be confused with today's country Ghana, it was bordering modern-day Mauritania and Mali. Despite existing political structures and civilizations in Western Africa, the introduction of Islam and increased trade led to an adaptation of an Islamic hit perspective. It's essential to recognize that Western Africa and its kingdoms had well-established political and social structures before the arrival of Islam. The integration of Islamic traditions occurred alongside existing political formations, resulting in a unique synthesis. The infusion of Islamic influence spurred trade, urban development, and governance, contributing to the Islamic character of the region. Nevertheless, the coexistence of Islam with traditional religions is a significant aspect. Traditional religious practices deeply rooted in Western Africa continue to thrive, or in areas where Islam didn't firmly establish itself, underwent syncretism with Islamic traditions. This dynamic interaction underscores the adaptability and resilience of the cultural landscape in Western Africa. The narrative of Islam in Western Africa reflects a global phenomenon, evident in the history of African Muslim slaves in the Americas. Similar to their homeland, these individuals grappled with negotiating their Islamic identity amid diverse cultural and religious landscapes. The interplay between traditional African religions and Islam persisted, shaping the cultural expressions of African Muslims enslaved in the Americas. Now that we have a brief understanding of Islam in West Africa, I'd like to know, how did any of these Islamic traditions in West Africa survive the forced immigration into the Americas while Christian and Western practices were overtaking their lives?
So Islamic practices were preserved through language and through the memorization of the Quran. So when they were brought to Americas, enslaved people from different regions of Africa connected through their culture, faith, and similarities. So in this case, West African Muslim slaves were able to create their own community. And this resulted to them leaving books, writings, clothing, beads, rugs, and diaries behind. So what differentiated them from others was their Arabic literacy. There were letters found in Timbuktu in Mali where Muslim slaves wrote in Arabic, and these letters are important in understanding how they practiced Islam and interpreted the Quran. So in their countries, they learned Islam, and it was preserved through their language and through Arabic. For example, Charles Ball, who was a non-Muslim slave, mentioned in his biography in 1837 that he remembers always seeing a man praying five times a day in his language, Arabic, and he adds that he had observed many others doing the same thing. So in Islam, prayer is done in Arabic and Quran verses are recited, and this proves that the Quran was preserved and memorized in their communities. So some examples of literate enslaved Muslims were Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, Omar Ibn Said, Bilali Muhammad, and they are known for their writings and their practice of Islam. So it was mentioned in 1940 by the great granddaughter of Bilali Muhammad, Kate Brown, how Bilali would pray alongside with his wife and how they would repeat Bilambi Kabara Muhammadu on beads to be reminded of Allah and the Prophet Muhammad. So for Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, he was a Quranic teacher in Senegal before being captured in 1730, and he was transported to London for his literacy. So he was freed because he knew how to write and speak Arabic, and he translated documents in Arabic, and he also wrote 2 copies of the Quran from memory. So this is an important example of how memorization of the Quran was preserved in Islam in this period. So they also used their language, like Arabic, as a form of resistance to write Quranic verses to condemn slavery. There was one incident where 2 Muslim slaves had escaped and had written Surah An-Nas, and it reached Thomas Jefferson, which later searched for them to free them due to their literacy, but they weren't found. And they used their language to condemn slavery through this surah, which is about seeking refuge in Allah from evil, which represented well what they were living and their need to ask Allah for help. Omar ibn Said also condemned slavery through verses of the Quran by mentioning Surah Al-Mulk, a surah about the power of Allah's sovereignty and that opposes the owner's supremacy. Another important example about preserving Islam through language was a document written by Muhammad Kaba Sagyangu, and he was captured in 1777, and in 1823 he wrote a guide for Muslims about prayer, marriage, and ablutions. Prayer being a pillar of Islam, there are also evidence that other pillars of Islam were preserved, like circling around the Kaaba, which is similar to a ritual about them going in circle and shouting after one round. Charity was also given, and it was sadaqah, which are rice cakes, and that is also a pillar of Islam, which is zakat. And also, it's not a pillar of Islam, but a blues singer like Alan Lomax's style of singing resembled the call of prayer of Adhan. So their admirable commitment to their faith in such horrible conditions came with consequences. Their slave owners, sellers would separate families and friends if they were talking in their languages. And as they would be separated, it would make it practically impossible for them to share their faith with their relatives. And with no cultural and religious heritage, a mix of Muslim and Christian beliefs created a new culture. So even though they had practiced their religion, prayed, recited, and wrote what they have memorized from the Quran, they were restricted, supervised by the slave owners, and removed from their rights and freedom. So my question is, how were they able to worship and practice Islam, and what solutions did they come up with?
Now we'll be talking about how African Muslims adapted their faith to their new life in America as slaves. So firstly, through prayer, which was a visible manifestation of their faith in the second pillar of Islam, people would pray aloud multiple times a day, kneeling and reciting the Quran, usually 5 times a day, but even more private worship for Sufi Muslims. They also used misvahs if they had them, and said Belambi Hakabara Mahamadu. Yaro Mamut would pray in public without fear of condemnation, However, others were not so lucky, such as Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, who was pelted with dirt while secretly praying in the woods by a white boy who knew that Diallo couldn't retaliate while in the middle of prayer. This hostility was often shown to people who practiced Islam openly, and if they halted their work to pray, they would be met with such violence. An unnamed Moorish slave in Louisiana confirmed his hardship in 1822 when he lamented that his situation as a slave in America prevented him from obeying the dictates of his religion. There was also a question on how people acquired a Quran in order to recite prayer. And there's lots of evidence that many people wrote one themselves, or some were gifted or passed down. But some people just didn't have a Quran, so they would recite prayer without one. Secondly, their dietary restrictions were something they had to adapt when coming to the Americas. So the fasting and not eating pork as well as alcohol, which is the fourth pillar of Islam. They followed these dietary restrictions despite being underfed and overworked. In order to continue to fast, slaves would pretend to be sick in order to fast in disguise without any suspicion from the slave holders. There was difficulty in adhering to food restrictions because slave owners provided the meals, so some people were forced to eat pork in order for them to survive, as there was nothing else that they could eat. But despite this, some still rejected the food that they weren't allowed to eat, which not only preserved their faith, but also gave them control over their own lives, which they didn't have very much of in any other sense. But some would be met with violence if they refused to eat the food provided for them, hence fasting in disguise. Some examples of people who fasted are Bilali and his large family, as well as Omar ibn Said. Now, lastly, the clothing is something that had to be adapted when African Muslims were taken to the Americas. So Muslim dress made some slaves stand out from the rest who were not in such clothing. Some women wore veils and some men wore Turkish fez or white turbans. However, it was not always available to them, and some also would be forced to wear sacrilegious clothing. An 1859 article described how each morning Omar ibn Said nailed the end of a long strip of white cotton to a tree and holding the other end wrapped it around his head, fashioning a turban. So the African Muslims clearly remained attached to their faith, and their enslavement was itself a good reason to be more devout. Faith meant hope, moral comfort, and mental escape, and it was also a link to the past and a time when they were free, respected, and for many, engaged in intellectual pursuits. So by adapting Islam to their new life in the Americas, it gave them a sense of identity, and they were able to live their past through their new experience. So after discussing the way enslaved African Muslims adapted their faith to their new life, we can now observe the archaeological evidence of how they practice Islam and further Christian resistance. What pieces of material evidence do we have of these people's lives, and why is it significant?
So I'm going to be delving into this question about the archaeological exploration of the Muslim identity in the context of American enslavement. Studying Muslim identity within the archaeological record is key to unraveling the intricate story of the African diaspora in the Americas. Our investigation takes us into the archaeology of Islam, building a foundational understanding of how Muslim identity manifested materially and the historical factors that led to the enslavement of numerous African Muslims. At the core of this question is the examination of artifacts recovered from archaeological sites, providing tangible connections to the lives and cultural practices of enslaved African Muslims. These artifacts serve as silent witnesses, recounting a story of resilience amid the challenging conditions of enslavement. Whether it's pottery fragments with Arabic script or personal adornments reflecting Islamic motifs, the distinctly Muslim expressions found in the archaeological record shed light on the diverse experiences of the African diaspora. The transatlantic slave trade forced millions of Africans to America, including individuals with diverse cultural backgrounds, including Islamic traditions. The merging of African and Islamic identities became evident in the diasporic landscape, leaving a lasting imprint on the archaeological record. Archaeologists, meticulously exploring layers of history, have unearthed artifacts challenging the conventional narrative of enslaved Africans as passive recipients of Western cultural assimilation. Instead, these artifacts bear witness to the persistence of Muslim identity, offering glimpses into a hidden world of spiritual resilience. Notable examples include fragments of Quranic manuscripts found in archaeological sites, delicate pages preserving a faith that endured the brutality of bondage. The archaeological record challenges the idea of a monolithic enslaved population, unveiling the diversity of African cultures, languages, and religious beliefs converging in the Americas. These culturally significant artifacts act as bridges between the past and present, fostering a nuanced understanding of the experiences of enslaved African Muslims. Now I'm going to shift our focus to the material dimensions of Muslim identity and the tangible evidence that speaks to the ongoing religious practices of enslaved African Muslims. Exploring the archaeological aspect of African Muslim enslavement in the Americas requires acknowledging the varied experience of Muslims globally. The focus here is on tangible evidence that speaks to the ongoing religious practices of African Muslims, highlighting the significance of understanding the 5 pillars of Islam and the broader material culture associated with Muslim practices. The absence of pig bones in faunal remains, coupled with the recovery of significant faunal remains, becomes a significant marker of Muslim dietary restrictions, shedding light on a crucial aspect of their religious identity. The archaeological lens extends to tangible artifacts linked to Islamic rituals, especially prayer. Objects like prayer mats, adapted to be made of cloth or animal skin, and prayer beads establish tangible connections to the daily lives of enslaved African Muslims. The 99 bead prayer necklaces, worn around the waist or neck, carry cultural nuances, contributing to the narrative of cultural continuity. Though evidence of fabric is hard to come by in the archaeological record to prove the use of prayer mats, remnants of animal skins and cloth, as well as oral and written records, point to the adapted use of mats. The written and oral records also make a point in shedding light on the pseudo-conversion of many African Muslims enslaved in the Americas. In the face of forced conversion and anti-Islamic practices by the West, Muslim slaves oftentimes feigned their Christian conversion to keep themselves and their traditions safe. Word of descendants and written diary entries or records explain the physical violence by slave keepers, practices of Islam met while maintaining their faith. Using their bilingualism, African Muslim slaves picked up Christian practices out in the public to save from physical beatings and increase their chances of future manumission. Veils, mats, fabrics, written and spoken accounts, and the recovery of identifiable beads reflect the diverse expressions of Muslim identity. The archaeological findings align with accounts from descendants, emphasizing the importance of women gifting rice cakes as a form of almsgiving. These material expressions underscored the varied ways in which enslaved African Muslims maintain their religious practices and traditions despite the challenges of enslavement. To summarize, the archaeology of Islam within the context of African Muslim enslavement reveals a rich tapestry of material evidence, offering insights into the daily lives, religious practices, and cultural resilience of enslaved individuals. Understanding the 5 pillars, dietary restrictions, and the material culture associated with prayer and architecture collectively contribute to a nuanced understanding of the diversity within the African diaspora. Enslaved Africans and their descendants were seldom documented in written records, typically only noted for transactions. However, a few stories of enslaved African Muslims have endured through autobiographies, diary entries, and letters. Most Muslim slaves were literate, contributing to the preservation of their narratives. Digging into artifacts from the past, hand charms and glass beads emerged as silent witnesses to the spiritual practices and cultural identities of enslaved individuals, especially those connected to Islam. These hand charms and glass beads go beyond their material existence, providing glimpses into the spiritual lives and cultural practices of enslaved African Muslims. Unraveling the mysteries embedded in these artifacts not only clarifies the past, but also instills a profound appreciation for the human spirit's ability to endure and transcend the constraints of history. Now that we've understood the past practices, adaptations, and lives of enslaved Muslims in the Americas, as well as the tangible evidence uncovered by archaeologists, how do individuals who identify as Black Muslims face modern North America? What sort of struggles do they face from society?
So in modern day North America, Muslims have a very complicated relationship with mainstream politics and culture. In 2001, obviously, the attacks on 9/11 in Manhattan changed a lot culturally and saw the beginning of a large shift in Islamophobia. And I will be examining a couple different articles from different times in the 21st century that examine the relationship of Muslims and Black Muslims in America with American life. So the first article is by German researcher Lena Kampf from humanityandaction.org, and it's from 2006, so 5 years after 9/11. And she basically expresses that after 9/11, the US government began implementing programs in hopes of, quote, curbing and countering terrorism and enemy combatants. And some of these programs included the USA Patriot Act and the National Security Entry Exit Registration System. And these policies, while on the surface were branded as terrorism prevention, they ended up targeting Arab, South Asian, and generally Muslim communities in America. And they had a huge consequence of beginning to equate Muslim identity with the danger of terrorism. And this, reflects a growth of Islamophobia and of the US's complicated relationship with American Muslims, growing starting in 9/11 and continuing through 2006. But we see with their next article from Al Jazeera.com, written by Ali Abunimah, who's a longtime journalist. He gives us an example from 2011, which is 10 years after 9/11, of a pastor in the US who is the leader of a megachurch, an evangelical megachurch, and he proposes to his followers that Muslims should be questioned on the basis of their patriotism. And he basically asks if it's true that Muslims living in America are just ordinary people, quote unquote, and who love America and are loyal to America. and he asks, is that true? Is that really true? And he goes on to suggest a lot of fear around the spreading of mosques in the US. And he proposes these really dangerous ideas about Muslim identity in America in general. And he sort of attacks the idea, and it sort of reflects this culture and this politics around Muslims growing ever more complex. And in this case, particularly in relation to other religions, Muslims here are being very directly targeted for their religion. And he expresses a lot of fear about this quote unquote danger of Sharia law and the supposed danger of Muslims sort of, quote unquote, infiltrating America with Sharia law in a sort of like sinister and immoral way, which, again, shows a lot of miscommunication and a misunderstanding of Islam, of Sharia law, of Muslims in America. And if we go into the next article, it's from sisterhood.com. It's by a journalist named Rhoda Musa, and it's from 2016, which is a very complicated year in American history, where we see the election of Donald Trump, who himself was extremely inflammatory towards the Muslim community. And it addresses specifically the lives of Black Muslims in America. And the author addresses an example of 3 Black Muslim boys who were shot and killed in Indiana. And the author expresses that responses to this event were sort of laced with a sort of disregard for these people because of their Blackness. And the author cites this Muslim idea of Ummah, which is a tendency to further ostracize Black Muslims. And it basically demonstrates that intersectionality in America between Blackness and being Muslim is extremely complex and not always synchronous. And it shows that even in the modern day, because each of these identities are very complex within the US and within the Western world generally, and within North America, it's very, difficult to navigate, being a Black Muslim and living in North America. And moving on to the final article. It is from 2021, and that is 20 years after 9/11. It's by an author by the name of Anmol Irfan. And she talks about a very prominent example of Islamophobia when in June of 2021, 5 members of a Muslim family were hit by a truck in London, Ontario, which killed 4 and injured 1. And she explains that the court system failed to efficiently execute the trial, which reflected sort of a lack of prioritization of a very significant and upsetting event. And in this article, there's also a examination again of being particularly a Black Muslim in America. And the takeaway is that being Muslim and being Black, in the idea of intersectionality, results in these identities being targeted in different ways. And ultimately, there is an overall issue of sort of psychological danger and damage that is really harmful, especially in the face of tragedies like this. You see throughout these articles, throughout the aughts to the 10s to the 2020s, there is a variety of examples of tragedies, and there with it follows this extremely complex culture of being Muslim in America. And it certainly is affected on an individual level in communities by bigger stories of tragedies. And it clearly is a complex issue that has been evolving for many, many years. And overall, it's clear that being a Muslim, being a Black Muslim in North America is an extremely complex place to be. Okay, now that we've discussed modern Islamic life in the Americas, what's an example of how Muslim culture has influenced mainstream culture in the Americas?
That's a really great question. And it leads us right into our cultural product of this episode. If you've stuck around listening to the ISLA 200 podcast, then you know each of our episodes delves into a cultural product. And today we're going to be talking about the blues, the music genre, the blues. In West Africa, Sufism played a significant role and was characterized by its association with music. Music, viewed as a means to connect with God, became an integral part of Sufi life. Various genres, such as chanting the Quran, religious hymns, supplications, and tilwaha, the recitation of the Quran, were practiced. The influence of music in West Africa spread through cultural exchanges with North America, leading to a fusion of Islamic musical styles. Enslaved West Africans who were skilled musicians brought their music to North Africa. North America, and later adapted it in Western Sahel. In West African Muslim areas, lower caste professional musicians attached to courts or wealthy families developed repertories of genealogies, praise songs, and epics. The musical style included wavy inflections, melisma, and the use of various instruments like lutes, one-string fiddles, the kora, and bellophones. The transatlantic slave trade brought millions of West Africans, including Muslims, to the Americas. Music was a cultural element that accompanied them, resulting in the development of new genres throughout the Caribbean and South America. However, African American music in the United States, particularly the blues, exhibited distinct features compared with other regions. The roots of African American music were traced back to Islamic West Africa, with scholars emphasizing the influence of the Sahelian music style. The ban on drumming in the southern United States during the 18th century significantly impacted the musical expressions of enslaved Africans. While drums and horns were prohibited, string instruments like the banjo gained prominence. The banjo, with its African origin, became a key instrument in African American music. Forced migration of enslaved people to the Deep South in the 19th century further shaped the musical landscape. The emergence of the holler, a solo, melancholic vocal style, reflected the harsh conditions of slavery. The holler, with its distinct features, laid the groundwork for the development of the blues. The blues, born in the 19th century, became a secular music of loss and defiance. Musicologists traced its roots to the West African Islamic belt, emphasizing the influence of Sahelian and Islamic stylistic elements. The blues, while not African or Islamic music per se, incorporated enduring contributions from West African Muslims to American culture. Islamic practices, including prayers, Quranic recitations, Sufi chants, and the call to prayer, possibly influenced the distinct musical expression of African Americans in the South.
All right. So thank you for listening to our episode of the ISLA 200 podcast. Today we dove into the lives of Muslim slaves in the Americas, their relationships with culture, politics, community, the implications of being Muslim in modern America, the cultural product of the blues, and much more. We hope you enjoyed. Have a great day. Much love and peace out.
This podcast was prepared by the fall 2023 cohort of ISLA 200 Islamic Civilizations at McGill University.